As engines of economic development, innovation districts are doing great. They're about the best economic development strategy going in the 21st century. We looked at 36 of them. What we found is on every measure we looked at, the actual growth is far greater in the immediate vicinity of these places than in comparable urban locations elsewhere. So it's working. So why is it working? Ideas travel best at short distance.
Hello and welcome to the Strategic Partnerships podcast series. My name is Madeline Arkins. I'm a research project officer at UIN and your host for today. In this episode, we chat with Cullum Clark, Director of the George W. Bush Institute's Economic Growth Initiative, who will share insights from his report about how universities and medical institutions spark local innovation, retain top talent, and build thriving communities. Join us for an inspiring conversation packed with actionable ways forward. I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Cullum Clark, who wrote a report earlier this year, Engines of Opportunity, How Eds and Meds Institutions Can Become More Powerful Drivers of Prosperity in America's Cities. Cullum Clark is the director of the George W. Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative and an adjunct professor of economics at Southern Methodist University, SMU, where he leads the Bush Institute's domestic economic policy work. With a 25-year career in investment management, he's held roles at Brown Brothers Harriman, Warburg Pincus, Cimarron Global Investors, and Prothero Clark Company. His PhD from SMU focused on monetary policy, urban economics, and economic growth. And to top that all off, he also has degrees from Yale and Harvard. And I'm very glad to be joined by Cullum today. Thanks, Cullum.
Thanks for having me, Madeline.
So to get us started, maybe you can share a bit about your journey and how you came to the focus of this report, your work at the Bush Institute.
Absolutely. The Bush Institute is the think tank, and as President Bush likes to say, the do tank arm of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas. And one of the pillars of our work is about expanding opportunity and economic mobility in America. So one way or another, we're always going to be interested in that topic. But I think what I have brought to it over the last several years is really a focus on looking at it on that question, how we can create more opportunity and economic mobility through a geographic lens. How can we create more prosperous, high opportunity places in America? Why place? Because lots of evidence shows that where you are on the map really strongly influences your prospects in life. I've also, just going back to my investment days, thank you for that nice bio there, always been very interested in what we call economic geography. Why do things happen where they happen? Because place really matters a lot all over the business world, economic world, and in other respects as well. That led me to a simple recognition. I don't think it's all that earth-shattering, but places that have strong eds and meds institutions, and by that I mean primarily research universities and academic medical centers, they've had a good 21st century for the most part. They've been outperforming other places. Simple observation. I wanted to understand that better. I mean, it's easy to kind of make generalizations about it, but I really wanted to dig in. Like, what are the actual, let's say, the mechanisms, and what are universities doing that maybe turn those mechanisms up more and produce still stronger effects? So that's how I came to it.
Nice. And it's a very detailed report, so it's clear that you guys really got into the meat of it. Maybe just to give a flavor of what it's about, what can you share? Maybe some success stories or examples of key ways that these institutions and academic medical centers can be these drivers of local economic growth and community development?
Sure. It's good to start there with just a general statement of why they play an important role in local economy.
Yes.
The basic reason is, for lack of a better way of putting it, ideas travel best at short distance. So it could have been otherwise. We could have found in the world that it really doesn't matter where the universities are. One could be based in somewhere on Antarctica. It doesn't really matter because the people and the ideas spread out everywhere equally around the earth. But that's not the case at all. So we looked at the whole issue through a kind of a three-part rubric. And we borrowed this from a University Economic Development Association and APLU, who really came up with this, but breaking things down into innovation, place, and talent, that these are three ways through which universities have large effects. Innovation, very simply, research universities do a lot of cutting edge science and related fields. And it turns out that when such research spawns a company, some kind of commercialization effort, there's a very pronounced tendency for that to happen locally, in many cases, very nearby. So we can talk a little bit more in a moment about the issues of a very high proximity, but that tendency is just really strong. It's a major factor why Silicon Valley and the Boston, Cambridge area have done as well as they have. Didn't have to be. That's one. Second, the place angle, very simply, academic medical centers and big research universities have a big footprint in cities. There is a long history going back many hundreds of years of universities being cloistered off. Like you can literally think of it as like a cloister where nuns might live, for example, in the kind of the architecture of Oxford and Cambridge, which was then borrowed by where I went to undergraduate school, Yale, and others here in the United States. So sometimes they'd like to think of themselves as separating themselves away from the surrounding city, but that's really kind of a vain effort in today's economy. One way or another, they have a large physical footprint, and they're going to affect physically what is going on in their city if they're sufficiently big. And then the third, on the talent front, need hardly say that universities produce the highly skilled, highly educated talent who are ready for 21st century STEM-heavy jobs in our world. But I think what's maybe sometimes underappreciated is the very strong tendency of great universities to attract talented students from all over the place and then keep them in that same city or metropolitan area after they graduate. That's a really pronounced tendency. It is certainly the case here in my hometown. I work for SMU. SMU, if you go back a couple generations, overwhelmingly attracted students from the greater Dallas area, to some degree elsewhere in Texas. Now they come from everywhere in the world, very diverse bunch of students from a very diverse bunch of places. And yet more than 60% of them, their first job out of college is working in the greater Dallas area. And that happens in great university after great university. So yeah, talent tends to stay local to a disproportionate extent. So what we've got, our report has a lot of concrete success stories, you asked, Madeline, in each of those buckets, but maybe we can get back to those in a moment.
Absolutely. And your description, I'm from Ireland, and I think what you described as the kind of brain drain of attracting great students into these cities and then them returning to their homes or seeking employment elsewhere is also a great issue in a lot of countries.
Yep.
Maybe to discuss perhaps the opportunities and challenges that you came across. In this report, you discuss how there's a number of different stressors affecting these institutions, like declining public confidence in the power and value of higher education. And certainly in the Netherlands recently, there's been proposed budget cuts of about upward of 2 billion, I believe, to the education system. So also very unsustainable financial models. Oh my, indeed. To your mind, what are the most urgent changes these institutions need in order to remain effective drivers of this prosperity?
If there's a core message in this report, it's that universities, particularly research universities and academic medical centers, are truly more important in the role they play than they ever have been in our increasingly knowledge-centric economy. But they are also at a crossroads in a number of respects. They face, you could say, several overlapping crises at once. And I think we have come to a point in time, we've seen these historically, some other points of time in history, when the idea of the university needs to modernize. We're in need of a lot of reform. So to boil down a lot of analysis of what this crossroads looks like, I think we can put it this way. Universities need to become more relevant again. More relevant. So what does that mean? On the teaching front, I think we've always had, going back to probably those medieval cloisters, an ongoing debate that's never resolved about to what degree should, a college, or for that matter, graduate education, lean more into learning how to do some useful trade in the world for after you graduate, versus to what degree should it be about generally enlightening you and enriching you through a broad liberal arts education. That will never be resolved. It seems that we have a pendulum that swings back and forth over time, in this country at least, but I'm betting in Europe and elsewhere also. And I think we came to a point where the research universities, the pendulum has been a little bit too much away from the kind of training for practical outcomes in life. In no sense at all would I recommend swinging all the way to the other extreme. I have 3 daughters, so the youngest is a senior in college now. I can tell you I've absolutely strongly endorsed in my advice to them. I don't know if they listen or not, but the liberal arts concept is a good concept. Please take advantage of it. That said, I think that what polls show is the public in this country is speaking with one very loud voice. And while there are differences, for example, across party affiliation, there's greater distrust for universities among Republicans than Democrats, for example, even among progressive Democrats, the sense that what they are doing is relevant has been in a dramatic long-term decline. So become more relevant on the teaching front. We can talk a lot about that. That's a big topic, but I've got a lot to say about that in the report. Become more relevant on the research front. Here's a simple observation that in the report, I put up a couple charts that came from an article in Nature that I wish more people would talk about. Very important article. The researchers in that piece looked at something like 25 million academic papers that had been published going back to World War II in a range of science subjects. And they had machine learning algorithms grade the papers for to what degree was the science in them breakthrough, transformational, changing our whole notion of how the universe works and giving rise to potentially revolutionary new products versus to what degree was it incremental, confirming what we already know. And over time, across multiple scientific fields, there was a big diagonal line downwards over time. The average score for innovativeness of those papers has been going steadily downwards for decades. And so it's a big topic, what sometimes we call meta science, like the science of scientific inquiry. But I think that we have across fields created a dynamic that sort of gives rise to very strong incentives to do what is safe rather than what could be breakthrough for university researchers. I think that there's probably always been some of that, but I would argue that the incentives have just been drifting too far in that direction and we need a shakeup. Relevance. And then the other piece is the economic, the financial equation. People have to believe that, first of all, if they, as young people or people whatever age, enroll in a program and undertake the cost of it and the opportunity cost of not working, at least not working full time, that the payoff is good. And moreover, society needs to believe that when it pours tens of billions of dollars into the research operation, as well as in supporting student tuition assistance, that society as a whole is getting a good deal. So what is the state of things on that? What the surveys show, just again and again, without any question, is the people who believe that a college education, at least in this country, has a good payoff, is worth the cost. That percentage has been in headlong decline. I think it's gone a lot further than the facts justify. As economists, we study something called the college wage premium. How much more money do people make by having a college degree? It's been in a long-term uptrend. It has not turned downwards. The value, particularly based on getting the right major, studying something that is in demand in the world. If one does that, the value is as good as it's ever been. However, the cost of attendance has also gone up pretty fast, and in fact, faster than the payoff, which means, compare the numerator to the denominator, the return on investment has actually been in decline. It's still good. For sure it's good, provided, again, that you study some things that the world will find useful. But it's in decline, and I think the public is maybe out a little bit ahead of the real trends. It overestimates how much it's declined, and universities do need to educate people on that fact that it's not declined nearly as much as they think. But nonetheless, it's a real challenge. So we need to see some breakthroughs on the financial model. Essentially, the financial model of higher ed barely changed in the last 50 years or so. We're in need of some pretty drastic change in terms of taking costs out and delivering really better content at a radically reduced cost. I think modern technology, as we're experiencing right now, creates possibilities for doing that, but we've only begun to exploit those possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. It does feel like a bit of a hamster wheel in terms of catching up to what needs to be on offer. And certainly at UIN, we're constantly talking about having more incentives for researchers to engage with outside of the confines of academia, and more incentivization beyond just publication in what can be perceived as the safe, easy pathway to
I in some ways, perhaps, while I'm just citing the Nature piece, that may be the most powerful reform that we possibly could implement. I think we're in desperate need of doing that.
I'm with you on that.
Do you want to be a part of a global community where universities, businesses, and public organizations come together to solve the world's biggest challenges? At UIIN, we equip our members with the skills, tools, and strategies they need to create impactful partnerships that drive real-world change. Whether it's upskilling your team, strengthening your institution's partnership efforts, or becoming more entrepreneurial, UIIN empowers you with the knowledge and support you need. Join us today. Visit uiin.org to find the best plan for your organization.
So obviously we're here also to talk about innovation districts, urban innovation districts, which you've also mentioned. And a key finding in the report is the rise of it. So post-COVID, decreasing land use by universities and growing urban innovation districts. You also mentioned ideas travel faster over a shorter distance. Can you explain what these districts are, why they are significant, and how these institutions can better leverage them from the successes you've seen so far?
Sure, absolutely. So one thing that we noticed in working on this report is that one of the fastest growing new dynamics out there really around the world is the rise of what we call innovation districts. So a place on the map, typically you can draw a line around it. It's formally defined. You could pretty easily walk from one end of it to the other. So we're talking about places that aren't very big. And while it's not necessarily the case that it has to be linked to an eds or meds, higher ed or healthcare institution. In practice, it nearly always is connected to one or often more than one. And what we're seeing is what was initially something that only happened in a few places in the kind of the last third or so of the 20th century. A couple prominent ones, of course, were Research Triangle Park in Raleigh-Durham area, North Carolina, and Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, across the street from MIT. Those were some early examples. They weren't really widely imitated until we got into the 21st century. And since then, we've seen an explosive increase in this kind of activity. I just observed that it was happening and started to inquire into it and look at it. There was a great article a paper put out by Brookings, written by Julie Wagner and Bruce Katz in the mid-2010s called The Rise of Innovation Districts, describing this. It's a great kind of key source. But one thing that I observed was that it didn't seem that anyone had yet actually tried to quantify how is this whole initiative going? What are the actual results of it? Because it's happening everywhere. It's clearly in vogue, but is it maybe just a fad that will pass? Or is it something that actually is, let's say, the next step in urban placemaking in a way that's likely to have legs? So we put together a data set on 36 US innovation districts. I would love to extend that to the world beyond the United States because it's clearly a fast-growing dynamic in Europe and also in Canada and certain Latin American countries. And they do it somewhat differently, but in some cases, there's very large places that are arguably comparable in East Asia. I'd like to do that, but we did rely pretty heavily on data that is a kind of US nature, US census type data. And the headline result is, as engines of economic development, innovation districts are doing great. They're about the best economic development strategy going in the 21st century. Maybe the only one that's even better is just to produce a highly educated workforce. That's still probably the greatest economic development strategy around. But at any rate, we looked at 36 of them. What we found is on every measure we looked at, just attracting people to work and live in the area, attracting in particular people of relatively high educational attainment, creating nearby relevant jobs. We looked a lot at housing markets. And while there's a lot of variety across places, because in general, we make it too hard to build new housing in 21st century cities in the United States and Europe. But notwithstanding that, nonetheless, the actual growth in the housing stock is far greater in the immediate vicinity of these places than in comparable urban locations elsewhere. So it's working. So why is it working? And this comes back to what I said at the beginning of our conversation, Madeline. It's the idea that ideas travel best at short distance. It just turns out that when people are doing innovative things that involves the transmission of ideas from one person to another person, it's best if they're not in a low-slung, sprawling office building surrounded by a gigantic sea of surface parking, and they never run into anyone else who works at any other place, unless they go to the once-a-year conference or something. It turns out if they can actually walk over to the coffee shop, not very far from where they work, and get together with someone who works in another place, that's a really fruitful way for actually ideas to propagate. There's a Stanford economist, Nicholas Bloom, who with colleagues has been probably the leading academic closely studying this phenomenon. One thing that he and his group have shown is that the effects of proximity in terms of transmission of ideas start to wear off after about a quarter of a mile. So you go a little bit further than that, and the tendency that people, let's say if two people are half a mile apart from each other most of the time, the odds that they will spend time together and move ideas back and forth between them or put two ideas together and produce a third idea, those odds go down a lot. Also, I think a big emphasis on innovation districts is not just attracting a bunch of office and lab type real estate, though that is certainly the heart of it. It is to create dynamic live, work, play environments where a certain fraction of the people are probably walking to work. Maybe no, that's not so shocking to you in Amsterdam, perhaps, but it is in many American cities. And this walkability part this is not just about innovation districts. This is something people yearn for. They don't get enough of it in American cities. This is a general challenge of our time on the housing front, on the revitalizing cities front. But in innovation districts, it just turns out to be vital. And in part, that's because you're trying to attract a certain kind of workforce. workforce that may skew somewhat young and certainly skews highly educated. And there's just the verdict is in. We know what such people want. They want a certain amount of walkability. They want to be able to live relatively close to where they work, at least a lot of the time. Some of them do. Maybe over time, they will move to a more spacious location elsewhere, but they'll still value all of the restaurants and coffee shops and bars and everything else that happen when you have a dynamic live, work, play environment at relatively good proximity and density. So wherever we go, wherever we look across these innovation districts, I've visited most of the ones that are in our data set. Everyone's trying to create that dynamic live, work, play environment. Some are further along than others, but there's not a one who says, no, we're not interested in that. We just want to be an office park.
I listened to the podcast interview you did with your daughter with Southern Medical Foundation, which I really enjoyed.
Oh,
and
great.
You mentioned the economic concept of complementing, not substituting, about entrepreneurship, and how entrepreneurship really does complement basic research, even though that's not often the feeling in academia. And it seems like proximity is one that could really be an aid, I think, like a natural aid in supporting that kind of relationship between entrepreneurial ideas and basic research, I think.
Sure, you were so nice to listen to that. Yeah, that was certainly one of the highlights of the last several years for me. Was my daughter is actually very involved in the creation, the growth of an innovation district in Dallas by happenstance. And she has a podcast that is involved with sort of supporting UT Southwestern, our leading medical school here in North Texas. And yeah, the point I wanted to make there about complementing, not substituting. I think in academia, there is an idea that is outmoded, which is that the more the institution tends to focus on entrepreneurship and the commercialization of ideas, that somehow that will be a substitute for, that will detract from, let's say, the traditional core mission of doing, let's say, basic research, advancing the frontiers of knowledge, independent of how that turns into products or jobs or enterprises in the real world, that there are substitutes. Our data, and this is not just the innovation district data, we also produce data more generally in the report on what we call the innovation impact of U.S. universities. So this is the impact in the real world, not just advancing the frontiers of theoretical knowledge. What we show without any question at all is advancing pure science, let's say, and advancing entrepreneurship, commercialization, practical applications clearly go hand in hand. It is unequivocally the case that the institutions that do a better job on one do a better job on the other. And by the way, there's plenty of other literature that shows the same thing. I'm not aware of a single study that would support the idea that the one detracts from the other, but it's common out there. And, I think we all need to kind of work against it. It's certainly a popular view among a lot of lifetime academics. But one thing we're certainly seeing, I find this every time I talk to people who are in a position to know, in leadership positions in universities, there's a generational change afoot. Younger academics are more likely to get the idea that these two things go hand in hand, that if they advance basic science and also devote at least some of their time, they don't have to be the CEO of the new company, they can find a partner. But if they spend some of their time helping figure out how the new science will actually impact the world for the better, and and helping build something that will make that a reality, those two things do go hand in hand, that it will strengthen their career, they will accomplish more. And they don't just sort of observe that, but they want it. When young, talented scientists and other academics are looking to where do they want to work, supposing they want to work in academia, they very clearly value places that will actually give them good outlets, good opportunities, a great platform for being entrepreneurial as well as doing innovative science.
Yeah, and it's great to hear that the tide is turning on that, because as you say, there's so much evidence to support that kind of engagement, and commercialization efforts really can boost the citation impact, the online engagement with articles, and so on and so forth, or even support future research partnerships. Maybe, I know the time always flies on these fireside chats, and particularly with such a in-depth insights such as this report. But maybe to close us off, Cullum, you mentioned earlier that obviously this is a think tank, but also, as Bush says, a do tank, very solutions oriented. Is there any sort of actionable takeaway, either for listeners or policymakers or institutional leaders? You can pick who the target of this should be, that should be a priority in order to address.
Yes. May I, Madeline, do one for people who run eds and meds institutions and one for public policy makers?
Please.
For the people who run the institutions, I think the big message of this report is figure out new ways to be relevant. I think there have been a number of great leaders in higher ed in recent years. We document a number of these efforts in our report at places like Arizona State University and Purdue University that show that it can be done. Caltech is another. They show how to make dramatic changes. They show that some of the trade-offs people believe in are in fact myths, that you can advance across several fronts at once in ways there where the advance on one front sort of reinforces what you're trying to do on other fronts as well. Teaching, research, building great surrounding cities, and so forth, building an entrepreneurial, and economic development oriented ecosystems. So it can be done. It is being done, but most universities have a long ways to go to really be where they should be on that. So that's one. Policymakers. We live in a democratic society, and this general disenchantment that I described a few minutes ago with higher ed does in fact bleed through to our elected representatives. A lot of our elected representatives aren't very big fans of higher ed these days. They're at best indifferent, and in many cases would actively like to punish or undermine universities. And my big message is that's a recipe for disaster. Please don't say, the universities are going in the wrong direction, therefore we must undermine them further and dismantle them. No, not at all. Be part of the solution. Be part of a great reform movement, a time of regeneration and modernization. And every level of government has a lot they can do about that. In the United States, the federal government is far and away the biggest funder of research. The federal government can heavily influence not just how much research activity takes place, but the incentives facing researchers. So I would suggest increase the funding, don't decrease it, and also figure out how to turn the knobs on the incentives to promote greater risk-taking, more breakthrough work. State governments in our country control a majority of the higher ed institutions. They're arms of the state, basically. State legislatures have it in their power to, for example, in a sense, incentivize their institutions to figure out new talent pathways, figure out how to maybe re-engineer a little bit the incentive schemes around tenure and advancements in universities, and to build up technology commercialization offices and operations, greater engagement with industry and entrepreneurs and so forth. So state governments have the power to do that. And local governments, the most important thing they do typically that affects universities is land use policy. It's being a partner in building great cities, including innovation districts. It would be very hard to imagine pulling all this off without local government support. So local government, I don't think is usually, they're not like as we would say in American football, the quarterback of the effort, but they can certainly be a supporting player. So I would tell all levels of government, be part of promoting the innovation and entrepreneurship economy. Don't imagine you can run away from it. Be part of the solution.
What an energizing note to end on. Thanks, Cullum. And at UIN, we're all about activating the quadruple helix. So I think it's always important to bring in the collaboration of all the different actors.
Thanks for the great work you all do, Madeline.
And thanks so much for your time, for starting your day off with this. For those who are interested in following your work, where can they find you? Where can they reach you?
Sure. On our website, the website of the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas, there's a wide variety of work that I've written, including the main report that you have so nicely referenced, but a lot of supporting shorter pieces. I've been writing about this in various forms for the last several years, so they'll find quite a few things about higher ed and academic medical centers.
Great. We'll be reading with interest in that case. Thanks so much again, Cullum, and enjoy the rest of your day. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks so much, Madeline.
See you, Cullum. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you for listening to the discussion. Follow UIN on LinkedIn, and if you're enjoying our podcasts, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your podcast platform of choice to help others find this content too.